Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us at the Timson Programme webinar series. My name is Andrew Brown and I'm a researcher at the Timpson Programme at the University of Oxford. Welcome to you all. So a little bit for a minute about the Timpson Programme for those of you who are new to the webinar series. The Rees Centre is a research centre at the University of Oxford, and we specialise in research about children in and around the care system, their education and their life outcomes, as well as outcomes for young people and adults who are also care experienced. This webinar programme is part of the Timpson Programme as a whole, and we do these webinars every couple of months and are available to view on the Rees Centre website. And we also, as I said, we have a YouTube channel where you can find these webinars and others from the series. And the Timpson Programme is one of the largest research programmes of its kind running at the moment. We're working with about 305 schools from over 25 local authority areas in and around the UK about the understanding of the impact of attachment and trauma awareness training in those schools. So what the Timpson Programme is doing is evaluating the impact of the training through pupil focus groups and staff surveys encompassing the full range of roles in the school. Now at present, the data collection is very nearly complete, and we're already analysing data from pupils, from teachers, from head teachers, class and pastoral staff in the schools and the wider school workforce. And in the coming months, we aim to publish further working papers focusing on attachment trauma training in the schools. We're also interviewing local authority leads and head teachers and analysing case studies from post-COVID case study schools, amongst other things. So it's very timely then that we're able to present the second working paper in this series, the journey to becoming attachment trauma aware, exploring experiences of 5 schools prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. So before I hand over to my colleague, Dr. Priya, who will present the paper, a gentle reminder to pose any questions in the chat as we go along, and we'll have time at the end for a discussion of the session and to answer many of those questions as possible. So I shall just pass you over to Priya.
Thanks, Andrew. I'm Priya and I'm one of the research officers at the Rees Centre, and as Andrew said, I'm going to be talking through the paper that we've just recently published looking at the journey to becoming attachment and trauma aware, and we're looking at the experiences of 5 schools prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. Andrew's just given an outline of the Timson Programme, but just to reiterate that the data that's included in the evaluation looks at online surveys with staff and pupils, case studies with staff and pupils, observations of training sessions, and also analysis of school and local authority data. The key questions that we're trying to answer through this programme is really looking at the impact of the attachment and trauma training. So how do staff adapt their practices as a result of attachment and trauma awareness training? How do schools change their policies and practices post-training? Do staff and children report changes to the school climate as a result of the training? And do children attend better and make more progress in attachment and trauma aware schools? So these are the kind of questions that we're looking at when we're carrying out surveys, interviews and focus groups with staff and children. So just to give an idea of how we've collected the data was collected in waves, so we had different groups of schools taking part at different time points. Today we're focusing on the schools that we collected data from at the very start, so that's wave 1, and we're looking at those schools where we were able to collect baseline data and follow-up data before any of the lockdowns were enforced. So you can see these yellow lines indicate where we had lockdowns in the UK, and we are going to focus on the pre-COVID data analysis. Because we look at the lockdown as a watershed moment. So we want to look at pre-COVID data because that's going to be quite different to the post-COVID data where, you know, schools were limited in the number of pupils they were taking and a lot of pupils were being homeschooled. So as has been mentioned already, this webinar forms a summary really of the working paper that's been published, and that paper is now available to read. So there's a link there, and I think there may be a link being put into the chat box, and that just gives a more detailed analysis of what I'll be talking about today. So in terms of the case study schools, the pre-COVID case study schools, we looked at 5 of those schools and they completed Sweep 1 and Sweep 2 interviews pre-lockdown. I've got to add that a small number of those interviews and focus groups were completed online sort of just after lockdown had been enforced. However, we were focusing on practices before lockdown, so we decided to keep them in the pre-COVID case studies. Interviews were carried out with various staff members, including senior management, teaching and pastoral staff. Focus groups were carried out with pupils, and transcripts were coded and analysed using a framework analysis approach, which allowed us to address the questions that we had in mind and look at the transcripts and see how they fit into answering those questions, but also allowed us to pull out any themes that seemed to emerge that perhaps we hadn't sort of envisioned at the start of our analysis. So the way we decided to look at our case studies was almost like a journey for each of the schools. We wanted to see where they started at the beginning of this journey, at the beginning of the training, and how they moved along over the year up until the second interviews and focus groups, which were done 1 year post training. So for the 5 schools, we found that they all had very different starting points. We had 3 primary schools taking part and 2 all-age special schools. And we spoke to each of these, spoke to the staff at each of these schools to find out what they were already doing. And then we could follow up at Sweep 2 to find out how things had changed. So schools 1 and 2 were actually part of the same federation. They had the same senior management team. They'd already adopted a very relational approach and had a good understanding of attachment and trauma and how it linked to behaviour. Schools 4 and 5, being special schools, also had some awareness of attachment and trauma, but they wanted to learn more about it, get more understanding of the theories, and also find out how to apply it, because they felt that it would be really beneficial for the pupils at their schools. School 3, another primary school, was actually very early in its journey. So School 3, the head was the driving force in that school. She was really keen to employ these new techniques and employ this new way of working, but staff perhaps were not quite on board. There was a very mixed response from staff and varied levels of understanding. Some staff members had sort of knowledge of attachment from perhaps their degrees, but there wasn't really a high level of understanding of attachment and trauma and the impact that had on behaviours. So it's not surprising then, of all the schools, School 3 was probably the most mixed in its readiness for change, because some of the staff just weren't aware of attachment and trauma, whereas in schools 1, 2, 4 and 5 there was some awareness, and so they've already felt they were ready to start that journey or continue on that journey because they knew how it would benefit their students. Across all schools, there was a 1-day training session covering things like emotion coaching, attachment, awareness, trauma and resilience. And so all schools took part in that. The training was delivered by either a professional training company or educational psychologists. And again, depending on the school, follow-up sessions were offered, or schools did their own kind of follow-up sessions. But to start with, they all had this 1-day session covering attachment and trauma. Moving over onto Sweep 2 then, changes over time. Sweep 2 interviews were done about a year after the first interviews, so about a year post-training. And these are the kinds of themes that we found came up as we did these Sweep 2 interviews across all 5 schools. The first thing we looked at was changes in attachment and trauma understanding, and not surprisingly, all staff reported that there was a change in attachment and trauma understanding post-training. They felt that they learnt the theoretical side of things, but also practical strategies that they could use in the school. And so even those staff who had prior knowledge of attachment and trauma and already working towards that, they also felt they could still take something from the training. So things like having scripts for restorative conversations, trying to understand why someone was behaving in the way they were by putting themselves in their shoes. So really taking on the strategies that were shared in the training, they found was really helpful in helping them understand attachment and trauma a bit better. Confidence of staff was another thing that came up quite a bit, and all staff reported feeling more confident post-training. So they felt that the sessions gave them the tools to support their pupils. They felt they could be more understanding. They had the knowledge to support the children with challenging behaviours. They also felt more confident challenging staff who perhaps were not quite on board and perhaps were struggling with adopting these new practices, but they felt more confident in being able to voice their opinions with those staff and, I guess, explain the importance of attachment and trauma now that they had sort of the backing of the training as well. And where staff members felt out of their depth and felt that they weren't able to cope in certain situations, they still had confidence that their colleagues would be able to support them if needed. And that comes down to having that almost whole school approach to training, so that they knew that majority of the staff had attended the same training session, so they were all sort of on the same page in terms of knowing the importance of attachment and trauma awareness. So we'll stop there for a moment and think about what kind of changes you think might help a school work in a more attachment and trauma informed way. This is one of the things that came up in our interviews, was how schools were able to change practice a year post training. So Andrew, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Priya. Please do ask a question or put your thoughts, responses to that question in the Q&A, and we can publish those and see what people think. But my immediate thoughts are, I suppose it could be at several levels, whether it's maybe at a policy level or at a senior leadership level, or more so at the chalk face in the classroom. But I imagine some kind of consistency in support would help those things along. And also I think and some of the work that we've been doing elsewhere in the Timson Programme about having the time and opportunity to talk amongst staff and staff teams, but also as in the way that we talk to the pupils around the school. So those are my thoughts. As you know, if you do have any thoughts, then please do let us know in the chat, and you can continue to do that if we move on as well. We can take a summary of those at the end as well. But those are my thoughts. Would you see opportunities for discussion? Did that come out in any of the case study schools, Priya, that you came across? Yeah,
so solution circles were one of the things that came up, where staff were able to, and not some staff members called them solution circles. They weren't always call that, but it was just a chance to have that sort of space to discuss certain children, certain issues they were having with another member of staff, and that kind of links into the confidence as well, where, you know, staff members felt confident they could go to colleagues who might also have a different perspective, an idea of how to address certain situations. So I think that was definitely one of the key things reported.
Yeah, and I see that's echoed by John from Oxford Brookes, who's very kindly put in the Q&A about opportunities for regular supervision and reflective spaces, and I think that's something that we were talking about just last week, wasn't it, in one of our team meetings. So it's that I suppose that realization that as a staff member in a school, that we're not alone, and we're doing this as a team, you know, and those are so very important. And another comment I see about more focus on the language used with young people, which is again obviously connected with talking to young people in school, and I think that's very important. I know there's quite a bit of work recently about microaggressions and how some of the smallest comments might, you know, affect young people who are finding certain things challenging for quite some time. So thank you for those comments, everybody.
Thank you. Yeah. So if I just talk through a few of the things that we found for this paper then. So yeah, some of the things that people have said, definitely changes in language were reported, and these changes were reported by all schools. And that was communication with both between staff and pupils, but also between staff as well. And they felt that the language used was just so much more positive, which obviously changed the feeling around the school as well. It just made it a more positive environment to be in. Other changes were approaches became more relational. So some schools introduced worry boxes for their children. Others would make sure that they greeted every child as they entered the classroom with a high five or a preferred kind of greeting. Staff were also starting to stop and think before sort of labelling something a bad behaviour. So it was, you know, if a child was acting a certain way, it was rather than just thinking, okay, they're being naughty, that, you know, this is bad behaviour, they were stopping and trying to understand what it was behind that behaviour that was causing that child to act that way and trying to address that rather than labelling those children. Of course, there were staff members that struggled to adapt to the new processes and practices, and those who were struggling were offered additional support by their senior management and colleagues. And in one school, they were also offered further training. So if the initial training session hadn't really helped them to understand, you know, how attachment and trauma awareness could have a positive impact, having further training might help those staff members to understand that. And I think the training also helped to highlight the importance of attachment and trauma, and helped sort of staff understand that yes, this is important. The impact that it could have on the children could be, you know, really positive, and then that kind of helped them to be able to embed it into their ethos, into the school culture, because it had been backed up by the training, and the training was something that was sort of seen as important by senior management for the whole school to be involved in. So I think that really made a difference in the way that attachment and trauma was sort of perceived. Andrew, you mentioned policy changes as well. So we did have changes in policy, and one of the key things was that all schools now refer to their behaviour policies as relationship policies. So moving away from that behavioural approach and thinking more about how to have that relationship with the pupils. There was a move away from sanctions and more of a focus on helping pupils understand consequences and giving them the opportunity to problem solve alongside staff. So in this quote at the bottom, it's quite a nice example of how, you know, if a child had, I don't know, pushed a table over and pushed some chairs and created a mess in a classroom, rather than saying that they'd trashed the classroom and they weren't allowed out at lunchtime. So rather than giving them a punishment, teachers were now explaining, you know, why they might have to stay in to help tidy up the classroom, because they can't learn in a classroom that's messy and it needs to be tidied up. So working together with the child rather than punishing that child was a better way of kind of addressing certain behaviours and helping a child understand the consequences of those behaviours too. So we'll pause again for a moment, and now it's about thinking about the barriers to implementing changes. And I think, you know, not just with attachment and trauma awareness, any kind of changes in schools, I'm sure, are met with some resistance. So I just wondered what your thoughts were on what kind of barriers there are to implementing changes, especially related to attachment and trauma awareness.
That's great. Thank you, Priya. This is all very positive stuff, and we'll just give people a minute or two to gather their thoughts. But there's been some more comments coming in about changes to behaviour management policies and understanding that behaviour is communication and is connection seeking rather than attention seeking, which I think that's a wonderful way of putting it. But certainly, as you said, changes to school, a school system is going to encounter some challenges, certainly. And I, you know, having previously been a teacher in a school, I can see immediately resource and time would be that, you know, here's a new initiative that's obviously well grounded, and it's very positive. And it's, you know, directly going to impact all of the children in the school in some way, and yet here we are about as a staff, you know, who are already, you know, working to the edge of capacity in all over capacity, I would say, in majority of places, and having the resource to do that. You know, is that about extra staff in the school who are able to build those strong relationships. But do please get those thoughts coming in about challenges to implementing changes. Perhaps if you are working in school, what challenges can you see in generally in your school? That's because it's all very well having the training, you know, and having the knowledge of how to make change, but making the changes is also can be quite a tricky thing. So thank you, John. John suggested that tensions in relation to navigating current government directives and for developing more relational approaches would be another challenge, and that's absolutely right, because this, you know, it's not a quick fix. It's not a magic wand that's going to produce instant results, you know, in terms of academic grades and attainment, I guess, but it's certainly one that will improve the well-being and the atmosphere and the climate within the school really quite quickly. And I know that's something that's been suggested in our other work so far. Perhaps if we carry on, Priya, we can round some more of those comments up at the end.
Sure. Yeah, so not surprisingly, barriers were apparent across all schools, and as you said, Andrew, competing priorities for staff, it's really difficult to balance what they're already having to do with you know, new practices, and even if those practices are amazing and they think they're really worthwhile, it's how do we fit that into a day that's already packed, and that, you know, that they're already trying to do a lot of sort of things in. One of the key things, though, I think post-training was staff buy-in and engagement. Now, you know, staff might have attended the training sessions, but still, were they really buying into the benefits of attachment and trauma awareness? And if they weren't, it was very difficult to get them engaged. We spoke about how schools might address that, and schools felt that actually strong leadership, so having a real strong message from the leadership teams, and perhaps having an attachment and trauma lead who could really promote attachment and trauma awareness, was really helpful in getting staff to buy into these new ways of working. And I think one of the key things, and it's mentioned in one of these quotes as well, is really for teaching staff and pastoral staff, actually, managing the needs of the whole class versus one pupil. I think previously, you know, if a pupil's misbehaving, you know, if they think they're engaging in behaviour that they think is bad, they might remove that pupil, and that's seen as a punishment, whereas the attachment and trauma awareness approach might do something quite different, but then it's thinking about, okay, what's the impact on the whole class versus that student. So a lot of staff did report that as a difficulty. Not to say that that would stop them from trying to implement the new practices, but they thought that it might be difficult because you know, they've got other children's needs to take into account as well. So I thought that was an interesting point made, not just by one person. So this, I think we've just touched on as well, but staff wellbeing was a finding I don't think we were expecting to find, but it was a really positive finding in that there was a recognition that staff wellbeing was really important. You know, staff were aware that more awareness of trauma and attachment actually was likely to have more of a burden on staff. You know, when they're unpicking all this behaviour, taking on children's stories and experiences, it's really going to hit hard for some staff members. Also, having attachment and trauma awareness and being more aware of it potentially could mean that staff are reflecting on their own attachment and trauma experiences. So well-being was a key thing that was touched upon in these interviews as something that actually senior management teams needed to be aware of, and if you're going to be working in an attachment and trauma aware way, you really need to be prepared for some impact on staff well-being. Promisingly, all schools reported, you know, ways in which they were able to address staff wellbeing and help to support staff who are working in this way. So that ranged from staff supervision, which I think was just mentioned earlier. Traditional counselling was offered by one of the schools, and another school actually was sending their staff on a specific training session on secondary trauma, so looking at how the impact of supporting someone through trauma actually has an impact on you, and being able to deal with that. So they had a whole session that was specifically around that, specifically for staff. So that was really positive. And I think indirectly it shows that if people are aware then of the impact on staff wellbeing, they are really getting what attachment and trauma means and the importance of it and how much of an impact it can have. So I think indirectly it showed that these schools really were taking on the importance of attachment and trauma, so that was really promising too. And finally, I think the importance of doing this attachment and trauma awareness training was, okay, what's the impact on the pupils? Staff reported changes in how they were responding to pupils, how they were communicating. They felt the schools were becoming more nurturing, and as a result, they were able to have more open relationships with their pupils and a more trusting relationship as well. So they felt, you know, one of the quotes says, we're probably going to get more children sharing information with us. Children felt more trusting and felt more comfortable being able to share things that they might not have previously been able to share. Now, again, attainment is something that we can't necessarily say whether there's been an impact or not over such a short space of time, but actually staff did report that pupils were more engaged. They reported improved learning, so they did feel, anecdotally, I suppose, that there was an impact on learning and that learning had improved. There was improved well-being, and there was also a positive impact on behaviour through using these new practices. Staff had also started to adapt their practice to individual pupils as well. So rather than sort of looking at a behaviour as bad and just treating everyone the same, they're looking at each individual pupil and seeing how they could help them. So the quote in the bottom right hand corner looks at where the focus might have been on trying to get a child into the classroom, and you know that was the most important thing. Actually, if that child was able to learn outside in a different room and you had the resources to support that, what's the problem of doing that if, you know, the child is actually able to learn in that environment? So it's really trying to think outside the box and trying to think on a more individual level where obviously they were able to. Now, I mentioned at the beginning that we looked at pupil focus groups, but for this particular small cohort of case studies, we didn't really have too much data that we could really work with. However, I thought these two quotes were really important because in the follow-up interviews, although pupils weren't really able to talk about what had specifically changed between time point 1 and time point 2, there was a report of less shouting and there was a report of less fighting, and that does suggest a calmer school environment. So I've included them there because I think that was quite important to flag up, although yeah, it would have been nice to do a bit more on the focus groups. So thinking about the schools then and the journey, all schools, as we mentioned at the beginning, had different starting points, but there were commonalities. So the attachment and trauma was generally viewed positively. Barriers were acknowledged by all schools. In terms of the next steps, all schools wanted to continue on the journey. So I think, you know, they really understood the importance of attachment and trauma awareness. There was a preference for whole school approach to ensure consistency. In a lot of the interviews, staff spoke about the importance of making sure that lunchtime supervisors were involved in training sessions, as well as office staff, because in all dealings with, you know, children, there needs to be a consistent approach, and so it was important for them to be involved to ensure that everyone was on the same page when it came to using this more relational approach to the pupils. And there was also the importance of continued training was also highlighted. You know, one training session obviously is never enough, so it was important to have follow-ups or having some kind of forum where staff members could get together try to discuss cases and be able to support each other, and discuss the approaches that they were using and how they might be working. So to conclude then, so all schools reported changes to policy and practice following the training. There were positive outcomes for pupils in wellbeing, engagement and learning. There was a positive view of the changes, but also acknowledgement of barriers, and to be sustainably embedded, frequent reinforcement of the learning is definitely needed. So, the learning and the training needed to be revisited, whether in-house or having people come in, on a regular basis to deliver that training. And just to finish then, this was a quote from a head teacher, which I thought really summed up the aim of attachment and trauma awareness. I thought it was a key reflection of the approach. So if attachment aware is the baseline in all schools, then we'd be a happier place. And I think we know that if we're happier, then we're able to learn and we're more open to learning, more engaged, and it's just a nicer place for the pupils to be.
Excellent.
I'm going to just try and stop
there
sharing my screen.
That's fine. Thank you. Thank you, Priya. That's really fascinating. If you have any questions for Priya, then please do post them in the Q&A. Perhaps whilst people are gathering their thoughts and processing that fascinating information, we can just step back to our last point, which is about the barriers to implementing in school. And I know that staff wellbeing certainly has come up. Quite a few people have mentioned about the importance of staff wellbeing and the idea of secondary trauma. You are dealing with, or you may be, if you develop a more relational approach, as you said, people become more relaxed, more trusting, and they may be disclosing some information that could be quite distressing. So I think that in a staff workforce that's already working to capacity with not much time, and if it's in a culture that, I don't know, someone else has made the point that it might be in a culture that's where that idea of reflecting on your emotions isn't a prime aspect of that culture, and maybe seen to be weak or to that it's not really that important. So that's really useful. Thank you for those comments, everybody, coming in. And I know one or two people have commented on staff buy-in and attitudes to change, which I know that you highlighted as well. And I think that's one thing about the Timson programme. We were keen to look at the whole school approach. So as you said, as much of the school workforce as possible, including the ancillary staff and the staff that might not be directly working with the children. But as I said, if you have any questions for Priya, do get them to put them in the Q&A. But I might ask one, Priya, something came to mind for me. So is there anything in the data so far suggest that, because you've talked about a journey really quite well there, so it's suggests whether the schools are first making changes to their practice, which are then reinforced by the policy, or are the changes being driven by the policy change to practice?
I think it's mixed. So with the two schools that were part of the same federation, they were already on this journey, so they'd already started practices that kind of were more relational. Now, whether that was practice first or policy first, I'm not sure, but I know it was driven from senior management, so potentially they would have made changes and told their staff that this is the way that we're going to go. For example, school 3 that was early on in its journey, it seemed like this training was kind of the start, and following from that training, it was almost as if they were doing it jointly. So thinking about, once they'd done the training, what came next, and maybe starting to implement the practices post-training. So mixed, but I think with I think most schools now are looking at changing behaviour policies to relationship policies, and actually that is the starting point for a lot of the schools.
Yeah, excellent. Do you think then that working for schools that maybe weren't on the journey or were really early in starting their journey, so hadn't encountered it as much. Do you think it was new to the majority of those staff, or has it, the schools that we've seen, or has it just sort of affirmed existing ways of working that might not have been encapsulated in a attachment and trauma sort of package before?
So again, for the school that was starting the journey, I think it was a new thing for the staff, and that's why there was a very mixed response. Whereas staff reports from some of the other schools said we were already working in this way, but actually now we've kind of got proof that this is the way we should be working, and there's theories to explain why we should be working this way. And so where staff weren't quite on board, they could use the training as almost like, look, this is kind of validation for why we're working in this way already. So yeah, I think it's a bit of both. With school 3, it was definitely very new for them.
Sure. We have a question from Elizabeth, who asked that, so we talked about staff wellbeing and maybe something about supervision, but Elizabeth raises the point, well, if we are providing staff with supervision, who provides it? And will the supervisors there then had any training for this role? And I don't expect you to answer that directly, but you might be able to maybe comment on if there was anything in the teacher interviews about how important that sort of well-being might be.
Yeah, so in terms of the supervision, I think what they spoke about mainly was very informal supervision. So it's almost like, whoever your manager was, you would go speak to them and have that space and time, and actually you had the opportunity to do that. So I think that supervision period was encouraged, whereas perhaps previously or in other schools it might not be something that's encouraged and you're just expected to get on with it and deal with things yourself. Whereas this time, people were encouraged to come and talk about any issues they might have, anything they were struggling with. And again, that will vary with schools, depending, I suppose, on resources and, what senior management think and line managers think, whether they think it is something that's important for their staff. But it's why it was such a surprising finding for me for these particular schools, and that they all mentioned staff wellbeing. So, which was a nice surprise.
Yeah, good, and clearly very important. There is a question about the implementation of the programme. Was it due to COVID? But I think that most of these schools, it was all pre-COVID, wasn't it?
Yes.
The interviews were, the training had been done, and the research and the interviews had been conducted before the pandemic, which seems such a long time ago now.
Yeah. So the programme came about long before COVID. And obviously we've had that watershed moment. So, we will be looking at case studies that we did post-COVID, and it will be interesting to see if, well, I'm sure that would have had an impact, but we'll be then taking that into account when we look at those case studies, which is why it's important to separate the two. Absolutely.
I have a question about head teachers, that someone's commented it was interesting to see the positivity from the head teachers. Do you have any, was there any indication of why that might be, why head teachers were so positive about the training or the impact?
I mean, it might be because they were the schools that were involved. I think schools had the choice, and local authority chose schools that would be part of Timpson. So perhaps the schools that have been chosen were already more likely to think that this was the approach that they wanted to follow. But yeah, for particularly these 5 schools, they were all very positive, and I think the drive came from senior management for all schools.
Yeah, sure. John from Oxford Brookes has commented that it would be great if we could disseminate these findings through initial teacher education. And I know that one of our other team is looking at a project about attachment and trauma approaches in IT across the UK, and I believe that will be published in due course. And I think we've attended some conference, but I agree, it definitely needs to be part of the standard curriculum rather than having such variability across the country, and we'll be looking for ways to do that, I'm sure, in the future. There's an interesting point here, Priya, too, about taking some of the elements of this relational approach into lessons for the children, into PSHE, about, you know, emotion coaching and perspective taking and reflecting on how emotions can drive behaviours. But I guess we saw that in some of the schools were adapting emotion coaching into their work, and was there something that perhaps from the focus groups were they able to say about anything about, not necessarily specifically about their regulation of emotion, but just the general climate of the school?
I think the focus groups were all very positive, even at Sweep 1. So, you know, children spoke about how the school was nice, how the teachers were nice, how they did speak to them about their feelings. I think some used the kind of feeling cards to help children put into words what they were feeling. So I think there was some of that already happening. And I think, yeah, it's really important for children to be able to do that, because where they don't know how to put their feelings into words, actually then how do they convey what it is that's going on with them? So I think it's something that it seemed to be happening in some of the schools.
And I think that can only be heightened and improved by teachers or staff across the school adopting that approach. Yeah. Perhaps then, if we might be drawn to close in a minute or two. So if you do have any more questions, then please do send them through to us. But here, I've got one here. Do you think, are schools using this approach? Are they targeting sort of vulnerable children and pupils that might need it, do you think? Or was there a sense that this might be something that would pervade across the whole school pupil population?
I think initially the reason that they were doing the training was they thought that it would actually be beneficial for a small group of children, but actually then realised that this actually could be beneficial for all children. So that was a learning that came from the training. So yeah, I think initially they didn't realise that actually, you know, most children potentially have got some kind of experience of attachment trauma related issues, and that when they're looking at behaviours, they need to consider that those behaviours could be across the board and not just for specific groups of children. Sure,
thank you, that's really good. I think we've stunned our audience into grand silence. I think the questions may have dried up there, so I think we'll draw this to a close if that's okay. But just a reminder to everybody that to seek out our YouTube channel, where this video will be posted in timely fashion, and where you can find our other videos as well from previous webinars, and to see the Rees Centre website, where there's more information and videos and more of the documents are posted there. But thank you very much, Priya, for your presentation and thank you everybody for joining us and posting your questions. I think we'll post the slides on the website as well that accompanied this presentation in due course too. But that wraps it up for today. So thank you very much for attending, and just wish everyone a safe and peaceful festive break wherever you may be. So thank you very much.